Welcome back to the Byzantine Catholic Seminary's online course, The Plainchant of the Byzantine Catholic Church. In this lecture, we will take a look at the history of the use of Prostopinije in the English language from 1979 to the present day. Recall from last week that a large but incomplete collection of English-only Prostopinije chants for the Divine Liturgy had been promulgated by the Byzantine Catholic Church in 1970, and later supplemented with music for Great and Holy Week and for Pascha. Meanwhile, a service book for the Divine Liturgy, in both English and Slavonic, was published in 1978 without music, and with English translations that differed in some places from the existing published chant settings. Some cantors sang the music as is, while others sang their own adaptations and settings. In some cases, these alternate sets of chants were published by individual congregations, as had occurred in Detroit in 1970. For the liturgical services of the daily cycle, that is for Vespers, Compline, Matins, and so on, music settings were only available in English for very few feasts and for Holy Week. These services had been disappearing for years, and where they were celebrated, they were either sung in Slavonic or to whatever melodies the cantor was capable of singing at sight. The Byzantine Rite Franciscans had published texts for Vespers and Matins in the 1970s, along with music adapted from Prostopinije and Russian chant. But the services in their books were increasingly modified away from traditional forms, and when many of the members of the community left the Catholic Communion in 1979 to form the Orthodox monastery of New Skete, their influence in the Byzantine Catholic Church effectively came to an end. In 1982, the Sisters of St. Basil the Great of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, published a small hardbound volume called The Book of Vespers, which contained complete texts for the office of Vespers on Sundays and weekdays, as well as the Sunday and weekday hymns in the cycle of the 8 tones, and the common hymns for various classes of saints. This book made it possible to celebrate Vespers in English throughout the year, requiring only the special texts for feast days and for the Lenten and Paschal cycles. This book contained just 3 pages of music for the 4 fixed hymns of the service of Vespers. This music was notated in the style of the 1976 Holy Week books, with some of the same rhythmic and melodic idiosyncrasies. One real improvement contained in the book was a careful division of each hymn into phrases, either broken onto separate lines or separated by asterisks, which made it easier for a cantor and congregation to sing the hymns to the Prostopinije pattern melodies, one phrase at a time. On the other hand, there was a move to abandon the singing of the special melodies called Podobni, as well as the full set of Prokeimenon melodies in the 8 tones. The Vespers book indicates the tone to be used for each hymn, and the name of the Podoban melody when one was specified in the Slavonic liturgical books. But the phrase divisions are those for the Samalasan tones, and this is reflected in a note seen above each set of Podoban hymns. Texts are edited to sing to Samalasan tones. In the same way, while music was provided for the Saturday and Sunday evening Prokeimena, the ones for Monday through Friday evenings were given without music, with only an indication of the tone and the note, "The following Prokeimena may be sung to the above tone 8, rather than to the prescribed tones." In 1985, the Basilian Sisters published an even more important volume, their Festal Menaean. This book contained the hymns of Vespers and Matins for all the major feasts of the fixed cycle of the liturgical year, along with the order of the service of Matins as an appendix. Although published without music, this book continued the printing of the hymns with phrase divisions, marked by asterisks. Additional books followed every few years. In 1989, the Sisters published the Office of Matins, with the complete Sunday hymns of Matins in the 8 tones, and a selection of weekday Matins material, as well as the Troparion and Kontakion for each day of the calendar. This also allowed those celebrating the Divine Liturgy to have a ready source for the Troparion and the Kontakion for each day to be used at the liturgy. For the Paschal cycle, the Sisters of St. Basil printed a Pentecostarion with the hymns from Pascha to the Sunday of All Saints. An appendix provided musical material from the 1976 Paschal Matins book, and also music for the Saturdays for the Departed. Finally, the Sisters of St. Basil published their largest collection, the Lenten Triodion, in 1995, containing the complete cycle of hymns for the entire Great Fast, omitting only the rarely sung hymns of Compline. When this book was published, it was in fact more complete even than the corresponding books published by the Orthodox churches in English. These books had a few drawbacks in common. They were short on rubrics, that is, directions for how the services are to be performed, and could be confusing for someone not very familiar with the church typicon or order of services. The translations were assembled from various sources, and occasionally the same hymn in Slavonic could be found in several different English translations in one book. And of course the books were printed without music, but they could provide and would provide a basis for the eventual restoration of Vespers and Matins in Byzantine Catholic parishes in the 1990s. By the way, what was missing at this point was a complete text of the 12-volume Maneon for Vespers and Matins. But since the Uniontown Book of Matins contained the Troparia and Cantaci for each day of the calendar, this was not seen as a great need for the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. From the mid-1970s onward, the Archieparchy of Pittsburgh had provided an ongoing 2-year cycle of cantor education, and in 1984 undertook an advanced Cantors Institute under the direction of Mr. Jerry Jumba. This school ran from 1984 to 86, meeting once a week during the academic year. A third planned year was never held. Instead, the 2-year Advanced Cantors Institute was repeated in Youngstown, Ohio. At the Advanced Cantor School, cantors were taught to sing in both Slavonic and English, focusing on the Divine Liturgy, and the instructors planned to use this as a laboratory for New English chant settings to replace those that had been created in 1970. As a result, the music used in this course changed from week to week and from year to year, eventually filling some 10 large 3-ring binders, much of it duplicative, since fixed music was reproduced for each feast day or service that used it. The Cantor School in Youngstown, Ohio was held as a 3-day weekend class, then as a series of consecutive Sunday classes. In January 1987, Bishop Stephen Kosciuszko of Pittsburgh was instructing all cantors to attend the course. Enrollees were promised new written music and encouraged to tape record the classes. Around the same time, Father Andrew Pataki became the Bishop of Parma, Ohio, and under his guidance, the Parma Diocese began its own chant education program, which included a newsletter, The Cantor's Voice, and an ad hoc committee of cantors to prepare needed service music for feast days, and most especially for the Liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts. In 1987, the Eparchy of Van Nuys in California, covering the western United States, sent each of its parishes 2 sets of liturgical music, one for the priest and one for the cantor, prepared by Deacon Michael Savko, along with tape recordings of the music. In a cover letter, Bishop Thomas Dolini stated that, quote, "It is imperative that we have a uniformity of singing in each of our parishes in the Diocese of Van Nuys." The Pittsburgh Advanced Cantor School was restarted in 1989 and again in 1991, now labeled a Chant Renewal Program. The last classes were held in 1992. The cantor education programs of the 1980s led to the re-injection of much music that had not yet been widely used in English or that had fallen into disuse. This did not pass without notice. In March 1986, Monsignor William Lev Kulik wrote in the official bulletin of his parish, Saints Peter and Paul Byzantine Catholic Church in Duquesne, Pennsylvania, "In the past several years, the English versions of our chant have been greatly expanded through the efforts of several people, and through our several successful cantor schools. We have been hearing much of this new music at Saints Peter and Paul Church in recent months. The melodies are strange to the ear, but they are genuine Carpathian chant. Eventually, you will grow familiar with this newly developed music. Just be patient. It would truly be a tragedy if we allowed this precious inheritance to die simply because we failed to make use of it. So please, no more complaints about the new and strange music. We will continue to use it and restore it." One of the key players in chant education in the 1980s and early 1990s was Cantor Jerry Jumba of McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania. After receiving a music education at Duquesne University, he devoted his life to Russin music, dance, theater, and folk arts. He expressed his dissatisfaction with the 1970 chant settings in English, particularly in the way the rhythms were notated, and set about to restore proper singing in church as a way to a deeper and more thorough Byzantine Christian spirituality. In accordance with his training and instrumental music background, Jerry Jumba taught that all music should be notated correctly, that is, with exceptionally precise rhythmic notation to match how an experienced cantor of the old school would have rendered the chant. This led to the use of fairly complicated music writing, which allowed some cantors to replicate the old style of singing, while confusing others who had to rely on their own internalized memory of how the chant was to be sung. Through the advanced cantor schools, Jumba documented many oral tradition variants, often on a single page. He adapted much Slavonic music to English, and preserved many melodies which would otherwise have been lost in the great simplification of the 1970s. He never allowed the publication of his liturgical settings, but instead distributed them by photocopy and postal mail. Many handwritten sheets labeled Byzantine Rite Carpatho-Russian Plainchant adorned cantor stands throughout the Byzantine Catholic Church. On the right-hand side of the slide, you will see a sample page from the material used and presented at the Advanced Cantor School, here the Resurrectional or Sunday Prokeimenon in tone 1. By comparing it with the example from the Byzantine liturgical chant at the left, you can see both how a longer melody here, taken from the Slavonic, has been used, and how the rhythmic writing is even more precise than that used in the 1970 collection. Another point, for example, in the 6th line of music, on the right, you can see that the word "the" is spelled Thee to represent correctly the pronunciation of the text. At the bottom is an example of a newer translation from the Pew Book and how the same melody might be adapted, thus attempting to resolve the problem of multiple English translations being used across the various chant books. A slightly different attitude was evident in the work of Mr. John Vernoski, a cantor from Fairfax, Virginia, in the Eparchy of Passaic. Beginning in the early 1990s, he began publishing weekly music leaflets with the variable hymns for Sundays and feast days. Some of this music was taken straight from the 1965 or 1970 chant publications, as you can see in this example in the lower right of the slide. Others were his own settings and adaptations, as shown in another page from the same leaflet on the right-hand side. Although he was later to become a champion of the 1970 Byzantine liturgical chant as, quote, the common music of our church, Vernoski's own publications frequently adapted the chant to the text in the 1978 Divine Liturgies book, in an apparent attempt to provide a simpler common standard of chant. This standard was largely based on the oral tradition, as Vernoski understood it, along with certain simplifying principles. For example, the idea that a high note in a melody should always correspond to an English accent. John Vernoski's settings sometimes changed from one year to the next, but their ready availability for purchase, along with a clean printed format to go with the text-only Divine Liturgies book, made them popular in many parishes. In the late 1990s, Vernoski also printed several books with music for Saturday evening Vespers and for Vespers on Sunday evenings in the Great Fast. The text for these books was drawn from the Basilian publications, but they were often highly abbreviated. Music was provided for the fixed hymns of Vespers, and for the variable hymns he simply noted, quote, the stichira at Psalm 140 and the apostichira may be sung in their proper tones, chanted on a single note, or recited. John Vernoski stated publicly that he looked forward to a time when Prostopinije, as music, quote, created for Church Slavonic, would disappear and be replaced by an American music for the Byzantine Catholic Church. He did work to introduce some melodies from outside the Prostopinije tradition, such as the use of Russian tone 1 for the typical psalms. Through his leaflets, he also recommended the use of Samalas in tone 6, a stichiron melody, for all the irmosi sung at the Divine Liturgy. Recall that in the Prostopinije tradition, every irmos has its own melody, and on feast days this hymn is one of the highlights of the Divine Liturgy. Replacing this with the stipulated use of the Samalasan tones caused a certain amount of confusion among newer cantors as to what the purpose of the Samalasan tones was and its relation to other hymns. So from what we have seen, the 1980s were a period of chant diversification. To sing the services, cantors either relied on their own memories of chant melodies or used materials they had obtained from a variety of sources. In a single parish, for example, the people might be following the service from the 1978 text-only book, while the cantor would have a copy of the 1965 Pittsburgh Gray Book, with one melody for each hymn, or the Passaic Green Book to follow the service. If using the Pittsburgh book, it might be interpreted in the style of the 1970 Byzantine liturgical chant. Music in the 8 tones or for feasts might come from the advanced cantor school, or from the publications of John Vernoski, or from musical adaptations done by the current cantor in the parish, or by a previous one. This wide variety of materials of varying quality, along with the heavy reliance on a new generation of less thoroughly trained cantors, was already leading to calls for standardization and renewal by the end of the 1980s, and these concerns continued into the 1990s. As we noted last week, the Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese published their own Divine Liturgy book with music in 1988. From the preface, we can see that, along with a concern for the English text, there was a perhaps greater concern for maintaining the sound of the Prostopinije melodies. Around the same time, Bishop Nicholas of the Carpatho-Russian Diocese undertook the preparation of books for Saturday evening Vespers in English, so that this service would not fall into disuse. The work was done by a musically trained priest of the diocese named J. Michael Thompson, who set the English texts to melodies from the written Prostopinije tradition, as well as to the oral tradition as sung by Bishop Nicholas, a man well versed in Prostopinije. When compared to the Divine Liturgy book produced by the same diocese, the Vesper books made more concessions to the accentuation and flow of the English text, often employing melodic variants from the Prostopinije tradition to fit short or long phrases. Controversy continued for some time in the Carpatho-Russian Diocese over the proper way to adapt English texts to Prostopinije chant, and to this day, some of these inconsistencies remain. The 19th and 20th centuries saw Eastern Catholics adopt a number of Latinizations, or liturgical and cultural borrowings from the Western or Roman Catholic liturgical culture. Examples of these Latinizations include the removal of iconostases from Byzantine churches, or building of new churches with no iconostas at all, the replacement of chanting with the recitation of texts, the introduction of the filioque, or the words "and the Son," into the Creed, in conformance to the Latin text, the practice of having first communions instead of communing infants and small children, the replacement of Byzantine Rite devotional services with Roman Catholic devotional services such as the Rosary or the Litany of Loreto. In the Byzantine Catholic Church, the 1990s then were a decade of De-Latinization, that is, of removing Latinizations and restoring Byzantine traditions. The Second Vatican Council, in its document on the Eastern Catholic Churches, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, had called for Eastern Catholics to zealously pursue a more perfect knowledge and practice of their own liturgical and spiritual traditions, and this had been echoed in the apostolic letter of Pope John Paul II, Orientale Lumen, in 1995. At the same time, a new generation of Byzantine Catholics, brought up in a catechetical tradition that stressed the enduring value of the Eastern Christian tradition, and influenced by the liturgical movement of the 20th century, were becoming more interested in the theological and spiritual meaning of the Byzantine Rite liturgical services, especially those services such as Vespers and Matins that had mostly fallen from use. This return to the sources had an effect on chant as well as on liturgy and prayer, as younger cantors began to look to the Slavonic tradition to reinvigorate congregational singing, and to provide traditional music for services which previously were celebrated only in Church Slavonic. To see one such conversation among cantors of this era, follow the link to the archives of the Cantor-L mailing list, an early internet forum for cantors trying to provide suitable chant settings in English for Byzantine Catholic services. In 1996, the Congregation for the Eastern Churches in Rome published an Instruction for Applying the Liturgical Prescriptions of the Code of Canons of the Eastern Churches. This document contained explicit guidance on the role of divine worship in the life of the Church, and on the renewal of each church's liturgy and worship according to its own traditions. It specifically addressed many of the Latinizations which had become traditional in the various Eastern Catholic churches, calling for their removal after due consideration and pastoral preparation. It also called for the restoration of the daily cycle of services, particularly Vespers and Matins, in each church, and quoted the decree on ecumenism of the Second Vatican Council. Everyone should realize that it is of supreme importance to understand, venerate, preserve, and foster the rich liturgical and spiritual heritage of the Eastern churches, in order faithfully to preserve the fullness of the Christian tradition, and to bring about reconciliation between Eastern and Western Christians. The instruction also directed the restoration of the celebration of the daily cycle of the divine praises, Vespers, Matins, and the Hours, quote, without delay. In 1997, the Eparchy of Passaic published a new edition of the Liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts, celebrated during the Great Fast. The new book was edited closely in accordance with the official Church Slavonic liturgical books, created at Rome in Rome at the 1940s. Unlike the previous Presanctified book from Monsignor William Lethkulik, it included hymns for all the Wednesdays and Fridays of the Great Fast, and for each day of Great and Holy Week, rather than one set of hymns for each week. In 1999, an edition of this service was published with music, prepared by Professor Daniel Kafka, a longtime Byzantine Catholic cantor and choir director in the Eparchy of Passaic. In the process, he made available a body of stichira newly set to the Samalasan tones, while maintaining proper English accents. He also employed some of the older melodies for the liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts, which until now had been replaced with a Lenten tone. This book, which was used in the other eparchies as well, served as a sort of wake-up call, showing how older music could be profitably presented in a usable form for congregational singing. It was part of a broader set of reforms that Bishop Pataki had made in the Eparchy of Parma, where he was bishop from 1983 to 1995. You may recall that it was Bishop Andrew who appointed a committee of cantors in 1986 to begin preparing music for the liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts. These reforms included the restoration of the third antiphon at the Divine Liturgy, and certain litanies which were omitted in the 1978 Divine Liturgies book. Around the same time, the Eparchy of Pittsburgh announced a new cantor school in 1997, offered from the seminary in Pittsburgh rather than local parishes, and led by a group of Byzantine Catholic priests. It was widely circulated that, in an attempt to resolve the liturgical and musical inconsistencies across the Byzantine Catholic Church, new materials, texts and music, were in preparation and would be taught through the new cantor school. Unfortunately, the early days of the school revealed that even the priests and cantors involved had differing ideas of how the chant was to be sung, ideas which sometimes made it difficult for even the instructors of the course to sing together. In 1998, the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of Stamford, Connecticut, sponsored a symposium on the English translation of Byzantine liturgical texts. This conference brought together clergy, scholars, and musicians from both the Orthodox and Catholic churches, including Bishop Kallistos Ware. The presentations of the conference addressed general questions of English translations of the Greek and Slavonic texts of Byzantine Rite services, as well as certain tricky spots, such as Theotokos. In their original languages, the Byzantine Rite services refer to Mary Most Holy as both Mother of God and Theotokos, or she who gave birth to God, a word with important historical and theological connotations. Some churches chose to use Mother of God for both expressions, while others translated Theotokos, in Slavonic Bohorodice, as birth giver of God, or God bearer. A consensus at the conference was that birth giver of God was awkward in English, while God bearer was also a potential translation for the word Theophoros, a specific title for certain saints in the Byzantine tradition, such as St. Ignatius of Antioch. One suggested resolution was to simply leave Theotokos untranslated, as is often done in the Orthodox Church of America. At the conference, Father David Petrus of the Byzantine Catholic Eparchy of Parma presented a talk on the experiences of the Byzantine Catholic Church with liturgical celebrations in English, while J. Michael Thompson of Chicago gave an afternoon lecture on singing English translations to traditional chant. Thompson, before entering into the Catholic Church, had been a priest of the Carpatho-Russian Orthodox Diocese in the 1980s and had worked with Bishop Nicholas of Johnstown in preparing books in English for Vespers using Prostopinije. Since that time, he and the professional singing group he led in Chicago had made a number of critically acclaimed recordings of Russian and Ukrainian plainchant and hymns. Follow the link below to one attendee's view of the conference. In 1999, Metropolitan Archbishop Judson of Pittsburgh promulgated a new particular code of church law for the Byzantine Catholic Metropolitan Church in the United States. In one of the articles of this law, the bishops directed that the Metropolitan Liturgical Commission is to prepare a standard text of usage for the Divine Liturgy. This is to be adapted to modern times and legitimate organic development of the liturgy. For this work, the bishops appointed a joint Liturgy and Music Commission with representation from each eparchy. As a result, it was possible for musical considerations to have an influence on the choice of translations as they were made, in order that the music and chant might fit together appropriately with the texts. The new text of the Divine Liturgy was completed in 2001 and sent to Rome for approval. In one significant change, the new text called for many of the public prayers of the priest to be chanted aloud rather than intoned quietly. This was seen as a consequence of the move of the liturgy to the vernacular, that is, to English. Thus, the people's responsive Amen would occur after they had heard the prayer to which they were giving their assent. In 2003, the Inter-Eparchial Liturgy and Music Commission was split up into separate commissions for liturgy and music. From this point on, the texts prepared by the Liturgical Commission were sent to the Music Commission to be set to the chant. The Inter-Eparchial Music Commission, which was responsible for providing chant settings for the new Divine Liturgy text, consisted of representatives from each eparchy under the chairmanship of Bishop Andrew Pataki. Recall that even before his appointment as bishop, Father Pataki had been involved in early chant settings as far back in the 1970s, when he was rector at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh. In its work on the music for the Divine Liturgy, the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission decided that, rather than attempting to select one of the existing sets of music and adapt it, they would start from scratch, using the written tradition and the oral tradition of Prostopinije in setting the newly translated texts to plain chant. They chose to do this in a very measured way, so that each melody was applied consistently and could be sung in a similar fashion, while respecting the liturgical text and proper English accent and phrasing. While they tried to maintain familiar melodies, they also deprecated, that is, gave lower priority to places where the melodies in Slavonic had been adapted or changed. And in general, where the Slavonic melodies had been overly abbreviated and simplified, the Music Commission expanded them to something closer to their original length, and made use of chant material from within the tradition to adapt the melodies to the English accent and phrase. They also chose to use a slightly simpler musical notation, in which the quarter notes and the double whole note indicating a reciting tone were to be sung with a rhythm appropriate to the text, rather than strictly interpreted from rhythmic notation. Triplets were removed, for example, and accents or phrasing were explicitly marked when necessary. Some examples of the changes and adaptations made by the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission include the following. There had been disagreement for some years over whether the usual psalm tone, da 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 da, was to have an accent on the final pitch or an accent which would move around between various of the last several notes. The Music Commission, following the work of the Advanced Cantor School, chose to place the accent on the final pitch, so that, for example, a text might be sung as follows. An accent on the final pitch, versus, here is a very long phrase, again, or, here are several phrases. The last pitch might be used for the word phrase or phrases, since the accent begins at the beginning of the word. The antiphon melody would always end with 3 half notes, which could be divided into quarter notes to match the accentuation of the text. Again, following the work of the Advanced Cantor School, the Music Commission decided not to musically adapt each cadence to a different pattern of notes, as we saw occurred in the early 1965 and 1970 chant settings. This allowed the antiphon melody to be sung more simply by cantors for additional verses, and also on feast days when the antiphon melody was used. The melodies for Triparia, Kontakia, and Stichira, that is, the pattern melodies, were established by consensus, with variant forms from the chant tradition used for long or short phrases. Also, the melodies for Prakimena and Alleluia, which had been greatly shortened in earlier chant promulgations, were restored in each tone to a length closer to that in the Slavonic and similar melodic complexity. However, the melodies eventually chosen were not always quite as long as the ones in Slavonic. In 2001, Metropolitan Judson appointed J. Michael Thompson as a professor of chant at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh and asked him to inaugurate a new multi-year education program for cantors. This course, taught on 5 Saturdays each year, was to cover the Divine Liturgy, Vespers and Matins, the funeral service and other occasional services, and the services of the liturgical year. The Metropolitan Cantor Institute, or MCI, also published complete service books for Saturday evening Vespers, weekday Vespers, and Sunday Matins, with notated music for the ordinary parts of the service and the texts of the Octoikos, or 8 tones. The texts in these books generally followed those provided by the Sisters of St. Basil the Great, but also made use of officially translated texts where they existed. The chant settings were those decided on previously by the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission. The MCI also inaugurated a website and a mailing list which distributed weekly leaflets for Vespers, Matins, and the Divine Liturgy for Sundays and feast days. Thus, music which had originally been prepared for use in the seminary was made available to cantors throughout the Archieparchy of Pittsburgh. In 2005, the Feast of the Annunciation, a very solemn feast in the Byzantine tradition, fell on Great and Holy Friday. The bishops of the Byzantine Catholic Church decided that, in keeping with the prescriptions of Byzantine tradition, the hymns for the Annunciation and for Good Friday should be combined on this day. They also took this opportunity to allow parishes to preview the work of the Inter-Eparchial Liturgical Commission, which had retranslated some of the relevant hymns, and the musical settings of the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission. The bishop's rather late decision, however, gave the Music Commission very little time to assemble the necessary materials, and there was hardly any time at all to prepare cantors and congregations. Texts for the Psalms were taken from the 1963 Grail Psalter chosen by the Inter-Eparchial Liturgical Commission, rather than from the psalms of the book Byzantine Daily Worship, which had been used in the past, and a number of priestly prayers were also provided in the new translations. The musical settings followed the recent decisions by the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission and proved jarring to some cantors used to the abbreviated chant melodies which they had made use of for decades. The situation was made worse by the bishop's announcement that the new materials must be used in each parish that year. Unfortunately, the whole process led pastors and cantors to be somewhat suspicious of any new materials that might be coming from the bishops and from their liturgical and music commissions. In 2006, an academic conference was held in Užhorod to mark the 100th anniversary of the publication of the 1906 Bokshai and Malinich Prostopinije. Conference papers examined the original publication of this work, as well as its influence in Ukraine, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and the United States. It is perhaps indicative of the place of Prostopinije in our tradition that the rector of the Užhorod seminary was heard to say that it had never occurred to him that Prostopinije could be examined in a formal or scholarly way. It was what you sang in church. The first set of these conference papers was published in the most recent issue of Eastern Church's Journal, and the remaining papers are being prepared for future publication. Most of the work on the new Divine Liturgies text and music had been complete for several years. The music was being used each week at the cathedral in Munhall outside of Pittsburgh and at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary. Portions of it were also used in teaching at the Metropolitan Cantor Institute and made available on its website as part of the weekly leaflet series. The entire service and its music, however, were not made available by the bishops for publication or teaching. However, based on this limited review period of public review, a few changes were made. For example, the settings of the tone 4 Samalasan melody were a source of concern. Recall that the Bokshai Prostopinije had omitted this melody, and over the years several different versions of this melody had come into use. The Music Commission chose to base their settings on a reconstruction of the phrases, based on the scholarly work of Professor Stephen Reynolds, but it ran into resistance from a number of longtime cantors. Finally, the Music Commission contacted the professor of chant at the Prešov Seminary in Europe, asking for a transcription of the Doxastikon of Saturday evening Vespers to the tone 4 Samalasan melody. This version of the melody was then adopted by the Music Commission, and the English settings were modified accordingly. In the same way, it turned out that the final phrase of the tone 7 Troparian melody was inconsistent in how it set text accents. This was pointed out late in 2006 by one of the cantors who reviewed the material posted on John Vernoski's Byzantine Catholic Forum, and again the Music Commission made appropriate adjustments so that all the melodies in the tone 7 Troparian tone sang the same way. Finally, in January 2007, the bishops of the Byzantine Catholic Church unveiled the new translation and music for the Divine Liturgy, provided books for each parish, and directed that their use was obligatory as of June 29th of that year. The new promulgation consisted of a service book for the priest and deacon for the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, and a second service book for the Liturgy of St. Basil the Great. A hardbound people's book for both the Divine Liturgies, some 466 pages long. A loose-leaf Cantor's Companion containing additional information and guidelines for cantors and readers. A set of recordings on 7 compact discs of the music from the People's Book. And a softbound book containing explaining the changes made in the new Divine Liturgy text, along with a DVD showing the liturgy being celebrated and addressing some common concerns. In the Archieparchy of Pittsburgh, the Metropolitan Cantor Institute devoted that year of the chant program to introducing the new book. In other eparchies, bishops met with priests and cantors to provide direction on how the new materials were to be used. Much of the objections to the new book concerned its size, the change in translations, the apparent loss of Church Slavonic, which was in some quarters claimed to imply that celebration in Church Slavonic was prohibited, and the sense that the new music replaced a single common tradition by which the existing liturgy was sung identically in each parish. As you've already heard, there was in fact a wide variety of singing styles, but each parish had its own individual tradition, which seemed in danger of being eclipsed by the new music. Some priests and parishes readily accepted the new book, especially those who had trouble obtaining adequate music and materials, and those that were already celebrating Vespers or other services, following music that used the settings of the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission. In the case of these parishes, the changes now allowed them to celebrate all their services using corresponding chant materials and liturgical texts. Others put off adopting the new materials until the last minute, or decided not to use them at all. By 2009, however, it was clear from the singing at the annual Uniontown pilgrimage that most of the faithful were familiar with the new settings and could sing them when led by a cantor. As a matter of fact, the problems on these occasions were more likely to be heard among the cantors, some of whom continued to sing the old texts and musical settings. The foreword to the New People's Book for the Divine Liturgy provided an overview of the strategy the commissions used for translation and musical settings. After noting that the translations in the new book were based on the New American Bible and the 1963 edition of the Grail Psalms, adapted where necessary to match the Septuagint Greek, the standard text in the Byzantine tradition, the foreword goes on to explain the musical settings. The musical settings are based on the Ruthenian tradition that has been handed down from one generation to the next. After extensive research, discussion, and detailed comparisons of various written and oral sources, the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission has compiled the Plainchant settings of the Byzantine liturgy found in this book. The musical renderings of historic scholars have been carefully adapted to accommodate the new English translation provided by the Inter-Eparchial Liturgical Commission. The entire 2007 Divine Liturgy People's Book can be viewed by following the link on this slide. The contents of the 2007 People's Book for the Divine Liturgies is also of interest. Of course, it provided the text and music for the complete Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, with several melodies provided for most hymns. It also provided music for the anaphora, or Eucharistic prayer, of the Divine Liturgy of St. Basil the Great. As you will recall from a previous lecture, since the prayers of the service are longer, the chant melodies were written in a longer form to cover the silent prayers of the priest. Now that these prayers were taken aloud, they could be served in a slightly shorter form, but there was still a sense that the melodies should be preserved. As a result, the new book included a set of traditional melodies for the hymns of the Liturgy of St. Basil, following the traditional Užhorod form but slightly shortened, as well as a much shorter set of melodies, lesser known and taken from the singing tradition of Prešov. This gave parishes the option of adapting the singing and the choices they make of melodies to the particular needs of the parish. The book also provided music for the Vigil Divine Liturgy, a combination of the beginning part of Vespers with the central and ending parts of the Divine Liturgy. In essence, the beginning part of Vespers replaces the opening portion of the Divine Liturgy. In the Byzantine Rite, this service is held on the eves of certain great feasts, to provide the faithful with a way to break the fast preceding the feast with the reception of the Eucharist. Now, with the reintroduction of Vespers into the cursus or liturgical cycle of the Byzantine Catholic Church, there was a conflict with those parishes which had begun to celebrate the Divine Liturgy in an anticipated form on Friday evenings, whether because of a large number of faithful or because of competition from Roman Catholic parishes, which likewise offered the convenience of a Mass or liturgy in the evening. Thus, several years before the promulgation of this book, the idea of celebrating a vigil Divine Liturgy on Saturday evenings, rather than a simple Divine Liturgy, took hold among some of the clergy as a way to begin to accustom the faithful to the celebration of Vespers, our proper tradition. Thus, the Divine Liturgies book included just enough of Vespers to serve the Vigil Divine Liturgy book, but it also included the remaining fixed hymns of Vespers in a section at the end of the book. The new Divine Liturgies book provided music for the Sunday 8 tones, the Vesper Stichira, Troparia, Cantacia, Prokimena, and Alleluia. The hymns of the Divine Liturgy for all the feasts of the movable and fixed cycles. Unlike the 1970 Byzantine liturgical chant, it provided them for the entire year, rather than just a few months. It gave hymns for the Divine Liturgy for each day of the week, Monday through Saturday, as well as hymns for classes of saints and for special intentions. It provided the text and music for the Panikhida, or the memorial service for the departed, as well as the Moleben, or the prayer service for any intention. In the last section, it provided a set of scriptural and liturgical hymns. Some of the features of the new Divine Liturgies book were specifically intended to provide spiritual, liturgical, and musical formation for the faithful in the context of the Divine Liturgy. For example, the new book provided settings for the Our Father in all 8 of the Samalasan tones. This would allow the faithful to become familiar with the patterns of these melodies as established by the Inter-Eparchial Music Commission, so that when they would come to sing these same melodies at Vespers, they would be significantly easier and familiar. The book also included 8 settings of the cherubic hymn, with corresponding music for the hymns We Praise You, We Bless You, and the liturgical communion hymns. As you may remember, it was in Father Pop's 1970 Irmologian from Slovakia that reminded the reader that these hymns were traditionally sung to a common melody, marking a link throughout the service. As noted before, the set material for the Vigil Divine Liturgy was added to accustom the faithful to the order of Vespers. And finally, at the back of the book was a glossary of liturgical and musical terms that might not be familiar to the faithful. A few things were missing from the new book. For example, the familiar paraliturgical hymns, which were often sung before and after the services and at communion, were absent. One of the decisions of the Inter-Eparchial Liturgy Commission was that at the Holy Communion, only scriptural and liturgical hymns should be sung, and that preference should be given to the communion hymn and its psalm, rather than to composed hymns in English or Russian. These hymns were still allowed and in fact recommended in the Cantor's Companion before and after the services, but not during the Divine Liturgy itself. Sources for melodies were also not indicated. For example, the Russian melodies were often supplemented by Galician or Ukrainian melodies which had become popular, so that both would be found in the book. However, it would have been useful if these had been marked with their particular sources, but this was not done, perhaps out of concern that ethnic disagreements would arise over the choice of music. There was also no Slavonic. Now, this was familiar in keeping with previous chant publications in English, but faithful who were familiar with the 1978 Divine Liturgies book in parallel English and Slavonic sometimes missed the Slavonic and cast about for a way to find some sort of replacement. In 2010, several additional books were published for official use within the Byzantine Catholic Church. Of these, the most important was a set of books for the Liturgy of the Presanctified Gifts, celebrated on the evenings of the Great Fast. This book contained notated stichira set to all 8 of the Samalasan and to the Bolhar tones. Both the verse and the stichiron melodies were provided with music. Remember that the verse is sung to one melody by the cantor, and the stichiron is sung to a corresponding and matching melody by the cantor together with the faithful. This new book also restored some older presanctified melodies from the Slavonic. The second book, published in 2010, was a book for the hierarchical Divine Liturgy, that is, a liturgy with a bishop presiding. This service is marked by the singing of some additional hymns, as well as the repeated singing of God Grant Him Many Years, addressed to the presiding bishop. Finally, a new Divine Liturgy booklet was published. This much smaller book with just the text of the Divine Liturgy itself, and one melody per hymn, was reminiscent of the 1965 Pittsburgh book containing the first official translation of text and music in English. But unlike the 1965 book, it specifically indicated in each place that additional music may be used, thus greatly reducing the likelihood that the new chosen music would become the only parish standard in those books that chose to adopt the Divine Liturgy booklet rather than the full People's Book. Ostensibly, this booklet was for use in special occasions, where, for example, many guests are present, but it is likely that it will become frequently used in some parishes as a replacement for the hardbound Divine Liturgies book. This booklet also included Slavonic text, without music, for certain of the most commonly sung hymns of the liturgy. In conclusion, today a Byzantine Catholic parish can assemble materials to celebrate the full cycle of services, Vespers, Matins, and Divine Liturgy, for Sundays and for feast days throughout the year, using traditional Prostopinije in English. This would have been virtually impossible 10 years ago. Some parishes, especially in mission areas, are making thorough use of the new materials, while others maintain their own local chant and text traditions. The success of congregational singing of divine services depends on the relationship between the pastor, the cantor, and the faithful, and a common commitment to sung prayer. This will be our topic for the final week of the course.